We come to the climax of the book of Esther in chapter 7. The key elements of the story so far are that Esther was an orphan Jewish girl raised by her cousin, who was included in a large number of girls who were brought to be potential queens, to go through beauty treatments and presented to King Ahasuerus for a one-night stand. And if he liked them, then he might invite them back. While the characteristics of Esther were such that he not only liked her, but he made her his new queen. At the beginning of his reign, he had 7 counsellors to guide him. But over time, another counsellor came in and became the king's chief counsellor. His name was Haman. But he was very careful in the way in which he operated, so that the king had complete confidence in him. And the king had commanded that people should pay respect, homage to Haman, just as they would the king. But Esther's cousin, Mordecai, who spent a lot of time at the gate of the palace just because he was concerned to keep track of what was happening with Esther, refused to bow down to Haman. And when Haman was told that it was because Mordecai was a Jew, he determined not only to have Mordecai killed, but to have all the Jews executed. And he put the proposition to the king, and the king signed the death warrant for all the Jews in the whole kingdom, without actually knowing who they were, for he had complete trust in Haman. Mordecai had approached Esther and said, "Well, you're the only channel to the king that can bypass Haman." And she agreed to approach the king. But she could not approach him at the political level. She could only approach him as queen at a personal level. And so she invited the king and Haman to supper. They came, and the king asked her, "What do you want? You can have half the kingdom." She said, "Well, if it please the king, come to supper again the next night." And so they agreed. This occasion really inflated the pride of Haman. But he was frustrated as he went home and saw Mordecai refusing to bow. He determined to have Mordecai hanged the next day and built massive gallows to make a big statement. But in fact, that night, the king read in the Chronicles that Mordecai had saved his life. And so the next morning, Haman had to honour Mordecai rather than have him hung. Now it's time for the second supper. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favour in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share Esther chapter 7. Esther has built the situation up by first offering 2 simple requests to the king to come and have supper with her, a banquet of wine. But the king knows that there is something much more important on her mind, and she had promised the king that she would announce it at this second supper. And so he is quick to raise the matter at the banquet. And Esther is not there, first of all, to condemn Haman. She begins with a simple petition. "I plead for my life, and I plead for the life of my people." So there are 2 levels of her request: her own life and the life of her people. "For we have been sold." Haman had paid money to the king for the right to destroy all these people. "My people and I." So she identifies herself with the Jewish people. She hadn't done that before. Mordecai had said to keep this secret because there were enemies, there were people who would prevent her from taking this position because she was Jewish, for no other reason. But she had gained her position because of who she was, her personality, her beauty, her character. And now Haman's scheme would have her destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. For this was his purpose, to destroy every Jew in the whole kingdom. And she says, "If we'd been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue." It is because it is death, and there is no benefit for the kingdom at all in the death of his citizens. I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. The Jewish people, because they have a fear of God, have always been industrious. We see that in the present time with the number of Nobel Prizes, completely disproportionately to their numbers. Because God blesses the world through his people, both Jews and Christians. King Ahasuerus says, "Well, who would dare to think such a thing in his heart?" Haman had not understood Queen Esther was a Jew, but she is included in his law. And so Esther says, well, it's this wicked Haman. He is wicked because there is absolutely no justification for such a drastic penalty, because Mordecai would not bow down to him. Is execution of all Jews the appropriate response? That's a wicked response. Haman realizes that he's been caught out. The king, in fury, goes out into the garden, and Haman pleads his life. Why should Esther plead Haman's life before the king? He was not at all interested in hearing any plea of mercy from the Jews, but that's the inconsistency of those who rebel against God. When the king returned, he was pleading for his life across the couch. A complete breakdown of decorum, for Esther was the queen. Will he assault the queen while I am in the house? The eunuchs, of course, understand what's going on. They don't offer information to the king unless it's really pertinent, but there's a whole network of eunuchs there. And they know full well the relationship between Mordecai and Esther, and of the gallows that Haman had built on which to hang Mordecai. Harbona tells the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf. It's at Haman's house. It is fitting, the king says, hang him on it. And so the king's wrath was appeased.